On April 2, 1988, Kansas City police received a call for an incident at 4315 Charlotte Street in the Hyde Park neighborhood. A neighbor reported a naked man crouching on his porch, wearing nothing but a dog collar. 22-year-old Christopher Bryson could barely speak when officers arrived. His throat had chemical burns. Deep marks scarred his wrists and ankles. His eyes were red and swollen. Bryson whispered to police, "He kept me tied to a bed for 5 days." Bryson led officers to the white Victorian house next door. 39-year-old Bob Berdella had just returned from running errands. He refused police entry, so officers detained him and obtained a search warrant. The second-floor bedroom contained a bed with burnt rope fragments attached to worn posts. An electrical transformer connected to wires led directly to the bed frame. A metal tray beside the bed held syringes filled with unknown substances, prescription drug bottles, swabs, and eye drops. A long iron pipe, multiple lengths of rope, and leather belts lay scattered around the room. Police found hundreds of Polaroid pictures and snapshot prints of multiple men during torture and death, with Christopher Bryson appearing in dozens of photos. Detectives discovered handwritten logs of torture details. The entries documented drug dosages, torture methods, and victim responses. One entry read, "Subject responded well to electrical stimulation." Another stated, "Increased chemical application produced desired compliance effect." In a first-floor closet, officers found a human skull. A bag nearby contained dozens of loose human teeth. In the backyard, partially buried under lime, lay another decomposing human head. Human vertebrae with hacksaw marks were scattered throughout the house. The quiet Hyde Park neighborhood knew Bob Berdella as an eccentric antique dealer who ran Bob's Bizarre Bazaar at the Westport Flea Market. He organized block parties and participated in local historic preservation efforts. No one knew about the torture chamber operating behind the walls of his Victorian home since 1984. Robert Andrew Berdella, Jr. was born January 31, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. His devoutly Catholic family included a father who physically abused him with a leather strap while favoring younger brother Daniel. When Berdella turned 16, his father died of a heart attack. His mother remarried quickly. Berdella was severely nearsighted, requiring thick glasses from age 5. This made him a target for bullying. In high school, teachers found him difficult to handle despite his excellent grades. He was vocally anti-authoritarian and condescending toward others. Despite academic potential, he dropped out of the Kansas City Art Institute after becoming involved with drugs and alcohol. Classmates noticed his morbid fascination with death imagery in his artwork and disturbing behavior toward animals. Berdella began experimenting on animals, learning how different chemicals and electrical stimulation affected living subjects. He kept detailed records of these experiments. To neighbors and customers, the 39-year-old antique dealer seemed harmless. He ran Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, selling unusual artifacts, occult books, and oddities. His business cards advertised that he had poison in his head. Customers assumed it was marketing. The torture methods Berdella developed were designed for psychological destruction as much as physical pain. He treated his basement chamber like a lab, and victims like experimental subjects. Berdella photographed every torture session, maintained detailed written logs, and recorded audio of victims' responses to different techniques. His crimes escalated in brutality and duration. Early victims were held for days. Later victims endured captivity for up to 6 weeks, while Berdella perfected his torture and brainwashing techniques. He believed he could create willing sex slaves who would choose to stay even when given opportunity to leave. Berdella was frustrated when victims continued to resist after extensive torture. He couldn't understand why his systematic approach wasn't producing the devoted slaves he expected. This frustration led to escalated torture and eventual murder when victims failed to transform according to his expectations. Between July 1984 and March 1988, Robert Berdella held at least 6 young men captive in his Victorian house for periods ranging from days to 6 weeks. His operation was methodical, documented, and designed to achieve complete psychological domination. Berdella's victim acquisition was systematic. He targeted vulnerable young men, particularly male prostitutes and runaways, operating around downtown Kansas City's bus station and the intersection of 10th and McGee Streets. His antique business provided cover for meeting potential victims. His reputation for helping troubled young men by offering food, shelter, or temporary work aided his predatory approach. The pattern was consistent. Berdella offered assistance to young men in desperate situations, invited them to his house for a meal or place to stay, then drugged them with alcohol laced with Valium or other sedatives. Once victims were unconscious, he injected them with animal tranquilizers and moved them to his basement. 19-year-old Jerry Howell was the son of another vendor at the Westport Flea Market, where Berdella operated his booth. Howell worked as a male prostitute and had a drug addiction. On July 4, 1984, Berdella offered to take Howell to a dance, but instead drove him to the Charlotte Street house. Berdella drugged Howell with alcohol and Valium, then injected him with chlorpromazine, a powerful tranquilizer. He bound Howell to a bed in an upstairs bedroom and began systematic torture sessions. Over the following days, Berdella repeatedly raped Howell while experimenting with different methods of inflicting pain and psychological trauma. The torture included electrical shocks administered through a transformer and alligator clips. Berdella used drain cleaner to damage Howell's vocal cords and prevent screaming. He used needles to puncture Howell's body in non-vital areas, documenting the victim's responses to different types and levels of pain. Berdella's first murder was accidental. He gave Howell too large a dose of drugs, causing the young man to choke and die from asphyxiation. Berdella dismembered Howell's body with a chainsaw and disposed of the remains in garbage bags. 10 months later, 20-year-old Robert Sheldon arrived at Berdella's door looking for a place to stay. Berdella held Sheldon captive for 3 days while refining his torture techniques. With Sheldon, Berdella used sensory deprivation for torture. He used chemicals on eyes and ears to cause blindness and loss of hearing. He also used controlled electrocution to inflict maximum pain. Berdella continued to document victim response to pain in a detailed, methodical manner. When a repairman unexpectedly arrived at the house, Berdella suffocated Sheldon with a plastic bag. After dismembering the body, Berdella kept Sheldon's skull as a trophy, burying it in his backyard. His routine has now been refined. 2 months after killing Sheldon, Berdella abducted Mark Wallace using his standard method. Wallace was held captive for several days, while Berdella developed a more sophisticated approach to psychological manipulation. He began each captivity with a speech explaining to victims that their survival depended on cooperation and compliance. "You did not choose to be here, but you are," he would tell them. "For you to survive being here, it could either be rough or it could be easy." The torture of Wallace included all previous methods, plus new experiments with different chemical combinations. Berdella tested various drugs to determine which substances would keep victims conscious and responsive while preventing effective resistance. His logs from this period show increasing sophistication in his understanding of human pain tolerance and psychological breaking points. Wallace was killed through a combination of torture and drug overdose. Berdella dismembered the body and disposed of it using his standard garbage bags manner. Walter James Ferris, age 20, became Berdella's fourth victim when he was lured to the house with promises of drugs and shelter. Berdella held Ferris captive for only 1 day before killing him. Berdella later confessed he believed Ferris had previously set him up for a drug bust with police. The murder was motivated by revenge as much as sexual sadism. Todd Stoops, a 23-year-old drug addict and occasional prostitute, had previously lived briefly at Berdella's house in 1984. When Berdella encountered Stoops at Liberty Memorial Park on June 17, 1986, he saw an opportunity to conduct his most extensive torture experiment. The torture of Stoops included all previous methods, plus new experiments in sensory manipulation. Berdella used electrical shocks in an attempt to blind Stoops permanently while keeping him alive. Berdella's logs describe Stoops' gradual psychological deterioration and increasing compliance with his captor's demands. Berdella believed he was succeeding in creating the willing sex slave he had always wanted. The extended torture ended when Stoops died from blood loss caused by the cumulative effects of repeated trauma. Berdella documented this death as a failure, admitting that he pushed the victim beyond human endurance limits. Berdella's final murder victim was 20-year-old Larry Wayne Pearson, whom he bailed out of jail and brought to his house in July 1987. Pearson was also held captive for nearly 6 weeks, matching the longest captivity period achieved with Stoops, the previous victim. Berdella's confession stated that Pearson was by far the most cooperative of his victims. This cooperation came after weeks of systematic torture designed to break his psychological resistance completely. With Pearson, Berdella used all of his developed techniques: electrical torture, chemical burns, physical beatings, and psychological manipulation. During the extended captivity, Berdella began to believe he had succeeded in creating a compliant victim who would willingly remain his prisoner. Pearson's cooperation was a survival strategy, but Berdella interpreted it as evidence that his torture methodology was working as intended. The captivity ended when Pearson bit Berdella during a sexual assault, requiring Berdella to go to the hospital for stitches. Berdella suffocated Pearson with a plastic bag before leaving the house. When he returned 3 days later, the body had begun decomposing despite the air conditioning running at full blast. Throughout all these crimes, Berdella maintained meticulous records. His torture logs contained detailed entries documenting drug dosages, torture techniques, victim responses, and experimental results. The logs read like clinical research notes, with entries such as subject showed increased compliance after electrical stimulation and chemical application to throat area produced desired vocal cord damage. The hundreds of Polaroid photographs found in his house provided visual documentation of his approach. The images showed each victim in various stages of torture, with many photos taken for documentation purposes rather than sexual gratification. Christopher Bryson escaped and ended Berdella's streak. He was abducted at 1 a.m. on March 29, 1988, and was held for 4 days, during which he endured the full range of Berdella's torture techniques. Bryson's escape on April 2, 1988, resulted from a rare mistake by Robert Berdella, combined with Bryson's intelligence and determination to survive. During his 4-day captivity, Bryson had endured Berdella's torture. His throat had chemical burns that made speaking nearly impossible. He had been electrocuted, his eyes were chemically damaged, and his wrists and ankles bore deep marks from constant restraint. Bryson understood that his survival depended on convincing Berdella that the torture was working, that he was becoming the compliant sex slave Berdella desired. This psychological strategy earned him small privileges that saved his life. For his apparent cooperation, Berdella moved Bryson from the basement torture chamber to an upstairs bedroom. He was still restrained to the bed, but the rope configuration was different, slightly looser to reward his compliance. Berdella also allowed Bryson to hold the television remote control between his knees while his hands remained bound. On the morning of April 2nd, Berdella prepared to leave the house to run errands. Before leaving, he gave Bryson a cigarette as a reward for cooperation. After lighting the cigarette, Berdella tossed the matches onto the bed near Bryson's bound hands. This combination, the looser restraints, Berdella's absence from the house, and the accessible matches, created Bryson's only opportunity to escape. After Berdella left, Bryson lowered the television volume to listen carefully for any sounds in the house. Convinced he was alone, he began working to free his hands from the looser restraints. Once he freed one hand, Bryson used the matches to burn through the remaining ropes. Free from the bed, Bryson faced his most dangerous moment. He had to escape the house before Berdella returned, but he had no way of knowing when that would happen. Naked and with ropes still dangling from his burned wrists, Bryson made his way to the second-story window. He found it opened. Looking down from the second floor, he realized he would have to jump from a significant height, but there was no other option. Bryson broke the window glass and jumped, landing hard on the ground below. The impact broke his foot and sent shooting pain through his injured body, but adrenaline and desperation drove him forward. Ignoring his injuries, he ran and sought help. Bryson's escape had been perfectly timed. He had been free for less than an hour when Berdella returned home from his errands, arriving just as police were questioning his victim and preparing to obtain a search warrant for his house. Once arrested, police immediately charged Berdella with kidnapping and first-degree assault, based on Bryson's testimony and the physical evidence in the torture chamber. As the investigation expanded and human remains were discovered throughout the property, additional murder charges were added. The Kansas City Police Department assembled a special task force of 11 detectives and one sergeant dedicated exclusively to the Berdella case. The investigation involved extensive excavation of the backyard, detailed forensic analysis of the torture chamber, and careful examination of the hundreds of photographs and detailed torture logs found in the house. Berdella's bail was set at $750,000. Faced with the prospect of multiple death penalty cases, Berdella's defense team began negotiations for a plea agreement. On August 24, 1988, Berdella pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Larry Wayne Pearson in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. This initial plea was part of a strategy to avoid the death penalty on the remaining charges. On December 19, 1988, Berdella entered additional guilty pleas to remaining counts of first-degree murder. He also pleaded guilty to charges related to the torture and sexual assault of Christopher Bryson. As part of his plea agreement, Berdella provided 720 pages of detailed confession, including torture methods, killings, and body disposal techniques. In his confessions, Berdella said had been directly inspired by the 1965 film The Collector, based on John Fowles's novel about a man who kidnaps and imprisons a woman in his basement. Berdella told investigators that his crimes were some of my darkest fantasies becoming my reality. Christopher Bryson's recovery was slow and difficult. The chemical damage to his throat and eyes required extensive medical treatment. The psychological trauma from his ordeal affected him for years. Following the trial, Bryson changed his name and relocated to southern Missouri to start a new life away from the publicity surrounding the case. Berdella was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and was incarcerated at the Missouri State Penitentiary. He died of a heart attack on October 8, 1992, less than 4 years into his sentence, at the age of 43. The house at 4315 Charlotte Street was purchased after Berdella's conviction by Dell Dunmere, a local millionaire who demolished the structure in 1993 and deeded the vacant lot to the Hyde Park Neighborhood Association. Today, only a driveway remains where the torture chamber once existed. This was the crime division. Until next week, stay safe. Over and out.